Clinical Systems Intelligence Training, Module 5, Systems used in primary care to manage QOF. I sell in a QOF area and didn't realise how much the systems influence the behaviour of clinicians. On completing this module, I understood more about exclusions and exceptions and how these patients get missed because of the reporting. What will you learn about? So in Module 5, Systems used in general practice to manage QOF, we're going to look at an overview of QOF domains and indicators. We're going to look at the built-in modules on EMIS, System 1 and Vision, and a quick look at QOF Masters or ARDENs, which is something else you may have come across. So the key objectives for this module: for you to understand the QOF domains and indicators and understand some of the language around it, understand how prevalence affects QOF income, have a better understanding of the tools available in practices for managing QOF, and know the opportunities and barriers that QOF reporting can present. So the background then: Quality and Outcomes Framework, or QOF. It's a voluntary annual reward and incentive programme for GP practices in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. So QOF hasn't been operational in Scotland since 2016. Measures, called indicators, are agreed as part of the GP contract negotiations every year. They haven't changed an awful lot over the years. There are small changes that happen just to keep things up to date. These indicators have got points attached to them that are given to GP practices based on how they're doing against these measures. So the indicators change every year slightly, but in general they cover management of some of the most common chronic conditions, for example asthma and diabetes, and management of major public health concerns, for example smoking and obesity, and providing preventative services such as screening or blood pressure checks. So performance for practices is measured against targets of highest and lowest achievements on a sliding scale of points. The points available vary for each indicator. The lowest qualifying achievement is usually 40% and the highest is 90 or 100. So what that means is, to achieve any points at all, you have to get at least 40% of your patients meeting these targets. And in some, if you get over 90%, you don't get any more if you get to 100. The clinical areas may just involve holding an electronic register, may have indicators to meet for a specific patient or disease group, and some indicators apply to most of large portions of a practice population, e.g. smoking data or cervical cytology data. So QOF in the devolved nations at the moment in 2020 is slightly different. So for Northern Ireland it's similar to QOF, but they don't get any points for holding a register. There are some different indicators, and the total clinical indicator points available are 375 for the clinical areas. And there's a link here if you want to look at the actual guidance that the practices have to adhere to. Okay, so for England, headline data. So the last data that was published shows us that 6,873 practices were included. That's 95.1% of all the practices in England. The highest recorded prevalence areas, disease areas, were hypertension at 14%, depression at 10.7%, and obesity. Greatest change in recorded prevalence was depression, which went up by nearly 1%, and the average achievement score from a maximum of 559 points was 539.2, and only 13% of practices achieved the actual maximum score of 559 points. For exception rates, which we'll look at in a bit more detail in a little while, the highest was for cardiovascular disease at 32.7% of patients being exception reported, and the lowest was blood pressure, which is 0.6%. So the QOF domains are split into these 4 areas. So we've got a clinical domain, and that contains 379 points, public health domain for 106 points, an additional services subdomain with 11 points, and then quality improvement for 74 points. Each point has a baseline value of £187.74p, so that's for England in the current year. Slight differences across Wales and Northern Ireland, but only in matter of small amount of pounds. Okay, so these are the clinical domains that are covered by QOF. I won't read them all out, but you've got atrial fibrillation, epilepsy, osteoporosis, and there would be a lot of differences between these. So in some areas, like epilepsy, you just get a couple of points for having a list of patients on your epilepsy register. In others, like diabetes, there are loads of different indicators and different measures that patients have to be achieving to get the points. So there's a lot of differences across these clinical domains. QOF data. So participation in QOF is voluntary, but rates are very high, with 95.1% of practices taking part. So the data that's collected covers the vast majority of practices and patients, therefore, across the country. So the data comes through automatically from the GP clinical system and is reported annually. Usually comes out sort of October, November time each year for the end of the following year. The QOF year runs from the 1st of April to the 31st of March for England and Northern Ireland. And the latest published data available is for the year ending 31st of March 2019. So QOF prevalence and its impact on practice income. Prevalence is defined as the number of cases in the practice population for a given condition expressed as a percentage. So when we looked at, we saw that the different QOF prevalence and the impact of that on practice income. It's very important to understand this bit. Prevalence is defined as the number of cases in the practice population for a given condition expressed as a percentage, and a higher prevalence rate compared to other practices means they get a higher pounds per point for that clinical domain. But there are more calculations involved. Obviously not identifying patients who are at risk of chronic diseases or those who are yet to be diagnosed are among the causes of increased A&E admissions and higher morbidity. And a good register of patients accurately maintained is the foundation of good care. There's no cut-off at the top of the range for prevalence, so that means that there's no cap on reward for practices that have high disease prevalence. So, and each clinical domain will have a different prevalence rate, so they're all calculated separately. Palliative care is the only register where that doesn't apply. So there's some calculations involved in working out how the prevalence for an individual practice affects their QOF income. So we can see here that you start out with working out what the raw practice disease prevalence is. So that's just a straightforward calculation, the number of patients on that disease register as a percentage of the practice population. You then work out what they call the adjusted disease prevalence factor, the ADPF, and that is looking at the practice's raw prevalence against the prevalence for the country. And again, these will be for England, for Wales and for Northern Ireland. If you've got a higher prevalence than the country, the average for the country, then your ratio will be above 1. If you've got a lower prevalence against the country, then your ratio will be below 1. So the example given here is if the practice has 20% more on their register than across the country, then their ADPF ratio will be 1.20. So each point is then worth more because you multiply it by that ADPF. And so the new value would be £187.74, which is the baseline value, multiplied by the ADPF at 1.2. So each point for that particular disease area is then worth £225. You then work out the domain income by taking the number of points and multiplying that by the new value. The final calculation is based on the size of the practice. So if it's a very large practice, then obviously they're going to need more to cover the number of patients. So you work out the national practice list size over the practice patient list size, and that gives you the CPI, Contracted Population Index. This makes more sense on the next slide. Okay, so these are some real life examples of practices looking at the difference in diabetes prevalence. So the first column gives you the practice size, and you can also see they're not too far apart, sort of 10,000, 8,000 and 10,000. So we can see the number of patients on the registers, and obviously they have to be over 17. So the practice prevalence for the first practice is 8.22, so they've got 637 patients out of a possible 7,745. So that gives them their practice prevalence. The baseline pounds per point when this calculation was done, so this was from last year, it was £179.26, and we can see that the national prevalence for diabetes was 6.93% for this year. So comparing the practice's 8.22% to the national prevalence of 6.93%, we can see that their ADPF ratio, their adjusted disease prevalence ratio, is 1.19. So the baseline point multiplied by 1.19 becomes £213.32p for each point that was available. And then the contractors' population index also means they're above the national average, so they're 1.18 is their CPI ratio, so they're above the national average size, so that's another increase. So their total domain income for diabetes would be £21,647. And if we look at the bottom practice, they're obviously a similar size, but they've only got 504 patients on their diabetes register out of a possible 7,879. So their practice prevalence is 6.40. Again, the baseline point is the same, the national prevalence is the same, but this practice's ADPF ratio is 0.92. So if we multiply the baseline value of the point, 179.26, by 0.92, that reduces it down to 164.92. Okay, this practice again are larger than the average, so their CPI ratio is back up 1.19. So the final calculation works out there that they get £17,466 for diabetes. But if you look at the difference between the top one and the bottom one, you can see the difference that prevalence can make. So the similar size practices, but because they've got less patients on their diabetes register, they're losing out on possible income there. So we've got three, so one above average, one at around average, and then one below average. So these are the QOF points and the values for 2019 and 20 for England, just as an example. So you can see the highest number of points available are for diabetes, so there's 70 points available for diabetes. And then we've got, say, 25 for COPD, 6 for CKD, down to the bottom where we've got just 1 for epilepsy. So you can see that there's a lot more work involved, obviously, in achieving those points. And then we've also calculated the pounds per patient. So if you were to add 1 patient, this is all assuming an average sized practice with average prevalence. So what would each patient be worth on each register? So as we can see, there's only 1 point available for epilepsy. We can see that there's only £2.15 for that 1 patient, whereas dementia, each patient is worth £124.90p. Right? So there's a big discrepancy. So it's not, although there is a baseline pounds per point, it will vary based on the number of points that are available for that domain and the value of those points against the national averages. So the QOF performance data is really useful for benchmarking practices and for CCGs. There's a website here, www.gpcontract.co.uk. It's open, the data is published and it's open for anybody to access. It hosts the latest published QOF data for all the practices that participate, and you can search either for practices or for CCGs or health boards. You can view prevalence and achievement data at all these different levels. So it's just a couple of examples of the kind of data that you can get from here. So you can see how the CCG compares in prevalence across all the different areas. And then you can look in more detail at a specific indicator. The example here is for diabetes, so it's looking at patients on the diabetes register, so you can see how the prevalence varies across the different practices. Okay, please pause the presentation here and answer the question in your workbook for test 1 for this module. Start again when you're ready. Exception reporting. So some background to exception reporting. So the QOF includes the concept of exception reporting, which was introduced to allow practices to pursue the quality improvement agenda and not be penalised where, for example, patients don't attend for review or where a medication can't be prescribed due to a contraindication or side effect. So patient exception reporting applies to those indicators in QOF where the level of achievement is determined by the percentage of patients receiving the specified level of care, i.e. to achieve maximum points for indicator DM007, at least 75% of the diabetes register must have a latest HbA1c of 59 millimoles or less. So exception reporting criteria. So these are the patients that can be exception reported. So patients who have been recorded as refusing to attend review, and you must have evidence that they've had 3 invitations in the last 12 months. Patients for whom it's not appropriate to review the chronic disease due to particular circumstances, e.g. terminal illness, and this will be at the reference of the GP. Patients newly diagnosed within the practice or who have been recently registered, and these timescales will vary according to whichever clinical domain you're looking at, so normally around 3 months, but in some it doesn't apply. The next one would be patients on maximum tolerated dose of medication. For example, the example of the HbA1c reading. If a patient has a reading that is above the target level, but you can't give them any more medication, then they can be coded to say they're on maximum tolerated dose and therefore they don't apply for that indicator. Similarly, patients for whom medication isn't clinically appropriate, patients who have not tolerated medication, patients who refuse treatment, patients who have a supervening condition making treatment inappropriate, or finally where the service isn't available. So these are all exception coding criteria. A slight difference between exceptions and exclusions. So exceptions, patients can be accepted for a number of reasons and are usually the result of a patient or a GP decision at a personal level. Examples of exceptions could be patients or carer refusal of treatment, a patient cancels or does not attend a consultation appointment, or a GP's advice that two types of medication or treatment methods should not be administered simultaneously for a patient. Exceptions are only measured at indicator level, not condition level, as a patient could be accepted from more than one indicator within a condition, but would be counted more than once if these exceptions were added up. So they're only the exceptions are for the individual indicators, so the little specific detailed measurements within a domain. Exclusions, these are usually as a result of the type of patient and can be considered as non-inclusion in a denominator due to the definition. For example, all men are excluded from the cervical screening indicator, which is a female-only measure. These affect the denominator. Patients newly diagnosed or newly registered with the practice will be excluded from the registers for a specific time period, which is usually 3 months. This project here shows the importance of finding these exception-coded patients. So as part of a larger project, we needed to identify patients who were not on optimal treatment for atrial fibrillation, so basically they weren't anticoagulated. And when we look at the QOF data, the threshold for the practices to achieve the maximum number of points is just 70%. So once they've got 70% of their patients treated, then they haven't got to worry about the rest from a QOF point of view. And what we found that many practices weren't actively looking for more patients as they'd reached their QOF target. When you look at the data, you can see that the QOF achievement nationally looked good at 83%, but the actual intervention rate, meaning the number of patients not taking account of those exception reported ones, was much lower at just 69%. Leaving a total of 31% of high-risk patients not anticoagulated and at risk of stroke. So you can see there 17% had been exception reported and 14% were either on aspirin, which isn't part of the guidelines anymore, or not anticoagulated at all. So by highlighting these exception-coded patients, many of whom were exception-coded specifically for warfarin, we were able to encourage uptake of alternative anticoagulation therapy for patients at high risk of stroke. So I think that just sort of points out how important it is to understand these exception reporting codes. So why might a patient not be included in the QOF indicator? Okay, please pause the presentation here and answer test 2, exception codes. Start again when you're ready. Okay, so built-in QOF management systems, let's have a look at these. So on EMIS Web we have Population Manager. So this is the Population Manager screen. Okay, as we can see here, we have the navigation pane. This shows the number of points that have been achieved. So we can see here for hypertension, we've achieved 6 out of 6 points for having a register, but none out of 20 for any of the actual indicators. At the top here we can change the view to see whether we want to see how I'm driving, which is what's the situation today, or look ahead, and you can either look ahead 1 month, 3 months, or to the end of the year. And that will show you the difference between if you stopped working now, what would happen by the end of the year. This is the QOF ribbon, so you've got some limited options here to run the searches, export the results, etc. Then in here we've got the actual searches themselves, so each indicator has a corresponding search, and you can check the search definition to find out what codes are in those searches. And here's the detail, QOF detail, so this contains the definition, the age-sex breakdown, the trend over time, the patients included. So if you click on here, you'll find all the patients that have met the criteria, and the patients excluded will show you the patients that haven't met the criteria. Okay, so within EMIS Web we have QOF alerts, and these are appearing in the bottom right hand corner of the patient's record as soon as the record is loaded. So if QOF data is missing from a patient record, an alert is automatically generated. It'll be displayed for each indicator required for that patient, so it's patient specific. If you hover over the alert, you'll see the full details. You can see here, so the asthma review overdue with a little yellow triangle. If you hover over that, it will show you the latest information. And then if you click on the zap key, which is the little lightning bolt, it'll open up a linked data entry template which contains all the correct information and the correct coding for these patients. So that's how they kind of capture data as they go through. We've also got the option to click on the little question mark symbol next to the alert, and that opens up the alert path diagram. This shows the background and the concepts that build the alert text. So this is like a little flow diagram that the patients filter through to see whether they get an alert or not. And these are system-wide alerts, and they're updated annually by EMIS to match the QOF business rule sets. The business rule sets contain all the codes and all the values that are needed to run the search. You can also manage QOF proactively. You can look for the QOF finder, so it's available from the ribbon, the menu, and it'll find patients who have a certain number of outstanding indicators. So you can define the GP, so you can have a different list for each GP. You can define the number of outstanding indicators. You can ignore indicators that have already been achieved, so for the whole practice. You can include only patients who can receive messages, so if you wanted to send text messages to the patients to get them to come in or to ask them a question. You can do a mail merge to send out to the patients, or you can create a list for further analysis. You can also find exception reported patients. It's slightly different here. By clicking on the patients excluded at the bottom of the QOF search, you'll only find a list of patients who have not achieved a specific indicator. However, patients who have been exception reported or who have been excluded because they are newly diagnosed or newly registered won't be found here. So to appear in the search and end up in either the included or excluded folder, the patient must first appear in the denominator search or the parent population for the indicator. So each dataset and business rule contains the information required to identify those patients who are eligible for inclusion on the disease register in the indicator denominator and the indicator numerator. The denominator or parent search is made up of the parent population eligible for that care as outlined in the indicator, and the numerator is the number of patients who have actually received the care. So patients registered in the last 3 months or who have been recently diagnosed will be automatically excluded from many of the denominator searches, so they're not going to end up in the, or they're not going to start off, in the parent search. So even if a practice have achieved full points for a QOF indicator, there could be many patients not receiving the care, so they might have been exception reported or they might have been excluded. So even when a practice tells you, oh, we're doing great, we've achieved all of our QOF indicators, there will still be patients that aren't on treatment. Okay, let's look at the same thing for System 1. So we access this through reporting and QOF indicators. So this is the QOF screen, and it displays the number of points achieved and available for each domain. So this is the first bit, and again we've got the how am I driving, so what does it look like now, what's it going to look like by the end of the year. You can open the domain folder and display the indicators, and it tells you the detail there. It shows the number of patients achieved, patients missing, percentage and points achieved. And you can open the QOF points folder to see how am I driving and end of year figures. So again, you can compare how you're getting on. To find missing patients, it's a bit easier in System 1, so there's a different folder. So we go to missing patients, and then we go to the different indicators, and we can see straight away the patients not achieved. So you can right click on the indicator and show patients to retrieve the patient record and review them, or you can export them into a table for further analysis. So those are your missing patients. And then the next folder down is excluded patients. So these are the ones that have been excluded at the beginning because they've been exception reported. Next page down is our national prevalence, so it shows us where this practice are against the national prevalence. You can see the comparison, so the unit prevalence is the practice prevalence, the national prevalence is obviously national, and then we've got the comparison. So that's very similar to the ADPF, so it's an estimate based upon the ADPF. It then works out the pounds per point. And then following on from the same sort of calculation, we've got indicator values. So for each individual indicator, we can see the points achieved, points available, and then the pounds per point and the pounds that have been achieved and the number of missing patients. So it's kind of work to do here. This is how the practices would look at it and see where is it worth spending their time. Then we've got target patients, which is very similar to the option within EMIS Web. So we can look at the target patients and we can see how many alerts they've got, so how many things are missing from their registers and what that would be worth to the practice to get that filled in. So these are the alerts, so they appear on the patient home screen. It's a different setup but the same kind of process. So it tells you what QOF indicators are missing for this patient, and you can use the blue hyperlinks to action them, so to add the detail. Okay, in Vision it's slightly shorter in that they go to clinical audit and it lists all the information here. So we can see the practice population, we can see which disease register we're looking at, you can see the exceptions listed separately, so if you want to know who they were you can click on there and see those patients. And then you've got the denominator and the numerator, and then the negatives are the ones that haven't achieved, and there's an option to put an active reminder on these patients, so that would be like an alert that we've seen on the other two systems. So this is in clinical audit. We've then got Vision Plus, and Vision Plus is sort of the latest version of Vision, and it automatically creates reminders in real time when a patient record is opened, and they're also interactive. So if you clicked on a line, so this would be for a particular patient, I think we've got Mickey Mouse here, if we click on there it would then show us what's missing, so it's smoking data, and then we can use the drop down boxes to add the information. So, and it only shows you codes that are relevant for QOF. We've also got a floating toolbar that you can open, so if you've got a patient record open you can use this floating toolbar, and it's context sensitive. So you can open templates, you can open non-QOF information, you can add a patient to a register from here, and you can access various calculators. Okay, then finally we've got Ardens or QOF Masters. These two have actually merged last year, so you might have heard of either of them. So Q Masters was EMIS Web and Ardens was System 1, and the two have merged together, and they're now known as Ardens for EMIS Web and Ardens for System 1. So they cover 2,400 GP practices, and they provide templates, coding alerts, recall systems. They work with PCNs and CCGs for locally commissioned services, safety alerts, searches and reporting, and they provide cloud-based reporting and dashboards. Because this is the kind of thing that they would have. It will allow GP practices and PCNs to visualise their QOF activity and ensure QOF income is maximised. Data from System 1 or EMIS Web is uploaded, and the information is displayed in graphical form, and they can also have reports on QOF registers and QOF indicators from here. So it's kind of in addition to what they've already got built into their system. I think the main benefit here is that it's across several practices rather than just individual practices. So it's not giving an individual practice anything they haven't already got on the reporting front. Okay, so some case studies here. This is about some on-site consultancy that we did with a group of practices. They'd recently merged. I think there were 4 different localities, and the GP in charge of QOF across the new group could see that there had been some big discrepancies. So the prevalence and the achievement across the 4 practices was very different. Their coding and processes were inconsistent, and not all staff that were handling data were aware of the importance of QOF, both the prevalence and the achievement, and sort of what difference it made to practice income. So the solution was we did some analysis for them of their current QOF data, and we did a kind of gap analysis to say, okay, this is high, this is low, this is what you're potentially missing. We then, from there, we set up some on-site training, and we brought together in one place relevant staff from all the 4 different localities, and then we went through their reports and we actually highlighted the coding issues, and we gave them advice and guidance on how to make sure that the correct data was being collected, etc., and make sure that they maximise their QOF income. And the results from that, obviously their QOF income increased because their registers were more accurate, and also we made sure that no high risk patients were missing from registers. Okay, so that's some support that you can offer, that we could offer to that practice or group of practices. This is across a larger group, so this was practices across Bradford District's CCG to maximise its heart failure QOF achievement. It was actually part of a larger project to ensure all patients were receiving optimal treatment, but we started with the registers. So we were faced with the challenge of both heart failure and left ventricular systolic dysfunction were being miscoded or not coded at all, meaning many patients are not being recalled for annual reviews, and they were literally just slipping through the net, and they weren't optimally treated. So before we could look at creating searches and highlighting patients to be reviewed by the GPs, we had to find them in the first place. So some of the original diagnosis codes for LVSD were removed during annual QOF changes, and that meant that many patients were unidentified by the practice QOF software as having LVSD and therefore not being highlighted, so they were being missed. So what we did there, we ran some searches, we found those patients with either old or missing LVSD codes, had them verified by the practice, and they were added to the registers, and you can see here the difference that it made. So across the group, the LVSD group, the prevalence increased from 0.27 to 0.41, and that was another 172 patients were identified and added to the practice heart failure registers. The ratio of LVSD to heart failure increased from 35% to 41%. 13 out of the 14 practices showed an increase in heart failure prevalence and resulting QOF point value. And the increase in QOF domain income of just over £11,000 was recorded across all 14 practices, which worked out at about £800 per practice. So we could see there was a good increase there. But the main thing was that we got those patients onto the register so they could then be part of the bigger project moving forward, making sure that they were on optimal treatment. Okay, so thank you for completing Module 5, Systems Used in General Practice to Manage QOF Achievement. Please make use of your workbook to record your notes and answers, as these will be used in the live webinar.